He repaired broken-down vehicles with nothing but worn-out tools, a cramped roadside garage, and a teenage daughter who believed in him when no one else would. Every day was a struggle to keep the lights on, until a woman in an expensive sedan broke down right outside his shop, hiding more than just engine trouble. What happened next changed his life forever. You're about to witness how one act of kindness on a rainy Tuesday morning led to the most shocking revelation this small town had ever seen. Ready to discover what happens when an auto empire heiress goes undercover and finds something more valuable than all her wealth combined? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The mornings in Millfield always began the same way for Clarence Hall. The distant rumble of early commuter traffic on Route 47, the sharp tang of motor oil that had soaked into every piece of wood in the building, and the gentle hum of classic rock drifting from the paint-splattered radio perched on his father's old workbench. Clarence, a lean man in his early 50s with calloused hands and laugh lines earned from years of coaxing life back into dying engines, stood beneath the hood of a 1998 Honda Civic that had seen better decades. The morning sun slanted through the open bay doors of Hall's roadside repair, casting long shadows across the oil-stained concrete floor that told stories of 1,000 automotive resurrections. "Come on, sweetheart," he murmured to the Honda, adjusting a stubborn carburetor connection. "You've got more miles left in you than you think." The garage itself was a study in organized chaos. Tools hung from pegboards with the precision of a surgeon's instruments, each wrench and socket in its designated place despite their obvious age. Mason jars filled with sorted bolts and screws lined shelves that Clarence had built himself from reclaimed barn wood. In the corner, a coffee pot that had been brewing the same strong, bitter blend since the Carter administration gurgled faithfully beside a small refrigerator, held together with duct tape and determination. But it was the details that revealed the true character of the place. Hand-drawn signs in teenage handwriting advertised Best Dad in Millfield and Hall's Garage, where miracles happen daily. A corkboard near the register displayed thank you cards from customers whose cars Clarence had nursed back to health for far less than they could afford to pay. Beside it hung a faded photo of a younger Clarence standing next to a pristine 1967 Mustang, his arm around a smiling woman whose eyes sparkled with the same warmth that still lit up his face when he talked about the good old days. "Dad, the coffee tastes like motor oil again," came a voice from the small office tucked into the back corner of the garage. Clarence chuckled, not looking up from his work. "That's because it's seasoned with experience." Riley, 17-year-old Riley Hall, emerged from the office, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing a flannel shirt that had once belonged to her father, and jeans with honest dirt on the knees. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned early that the world didn't owe her anything, but that didn't mean she couldn't earn her place in it. Riley had inherited her father's mechanical intuition and her mother's fierce intelligence, though she'd never known the woman who'd given her life. Sarah Hall had died in a car accident when Riley was just 2 years old, leaving Clarence to raise their daughter alone above the garage that had become both their home and their livelihood. Double quotes Mrs. Patterson called, Riley said, settling onto a worn bar stool that served as the garage's customer seating. "Her Buick is making that grinding noise again," Clarence sighed, wiping his hands on a red shop rag that had been white sometime in the previous decade. "Third time this month, that transmission is hanging on by a prayer and good intentions. Maybe we should tell her to start shopping for something newer." "With what money?" Clarence shook his head. "Mrs. Patterson's been stretching her Social Security check to cover groceries and medication. If we can keep that Buick running another 6 months, that's 6 months she doesn't have to choose between food and transportation." This was the reality of Hall's roadside repair. Clarence Hall wasn't just fixing cars. He was providing lifelines to people who couldn't afford to be stranded. His customer base consisted largely of folks who had been overlooked by the sleek, modern repair shops in the county seat 20 miles away, elderly residents on fixed incomes, young families struggling to make ends meet, and anyone else who needed honest work at honest prices. The garage's location reflected its clientele perfectly, situated on a stretch of cracked asphalt that had once been part of the main thoroughfare. Before the interstate bypassed Millfield, Hall's Roadside Repair occupied a converted gas station that Clarence had bought for back taxes. 15 years earlier, the old pump islands still stood out front, their rounded tops now serving as workbenches for outdoor repairs. Above the bay doors, a hand-painted sign announced Hall's Roadside Repair. Fair prices, honest work, good people in letters that Riley had carefully touched up every spring. Inside the office, which doubled as their kitchen and Riley's study, space, a hot plate, and a mini refrigerator provided basic meal preparation capabilities. The apartment upstairs was small but comfortable, with 2 bedrooms, a living area furnished with second-hand finds that Clarence had lovingly restored, and windows that looked out over the rolling hills that surrounded Millfield like a protective embrace. "You finish your calculus homework?" Clarence asked, emerging from beneath the Honda's hood with a satisfied smile. The engine was purring now, ready to carry its owner through another few thousand miles of daily life. "Already done, and I started on that scholarship essay for state." Riley picked up a wrench and absently tested its weight. The gesture as natural as breathing, the one about overcoming challenges. Clarence felt his chest tighten with pride and worry in equal measure. Riley had been accepted to the State University's engineering program with a partial scholarship, but partial wasn't enough, even with her working weekends at the diner and Clarence taking on every repair job he could handle. They were still several $1,000s short of making college a reality. "What did you write about?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Riley shrugged, but her eyes held a depth that sometimes caught Clarence off guard. "About how growing up here taught me that the most important repairs happen to people, not just machines. About how you can fix almost anything if you care enough to understand what's really broken." The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist that had settled in the valley overnight. Soon, the first customers would arrive. Mr. Jenkins with his rattling pickup truck, young Tommy Morrison with the motorcycle that refused to start reliably, maybe Mrs. Chen with her ancient Corolla that had somehow made it past 300,000 miles through sheer force of will, and Clarence's patient ministrations. Each repair brought in just enough money to keep the lights on, put food on the table, and inch Riley a little closer to her dreams. But lately, Clarence had been running calculations in his head, and the numbers weren't adding up. College tuition, even with the scholarship, would require resources they simply didn't have. He'd already mortgaged the garage once to pay for Riley's mother's medical bills, and the banks weren't interested in talking to a small-town mechanic about additional loans. Still, he wouldn't let Riley see his worry. Every morning, he greeted the day with the same quiet determination that had carried him through 17 years of single parenthood, countless sleepless nights spent hunched over broken engines, and the daily challenge of raising a brilliant daughter while running a business that operated on hope as much as skill. The radio crackled, shifting from a classic rock ballad to the morning farm report, its familiar rhythm providing soundtrack to another day in the life of Hall's Roadside Repair. Outside, Millfield * was beginning to stir, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where neighbors still helped neighbors, and where a man's reputation was built on handshakes, kept promises, and the simple act of treating people with dignity regardless of their circumstances. Clarence Hall didn't know that this particular Tuesday morning would be different from all the others. He couldn't have predicted that before the sun reached its peak. His quiet life would intersect with forces far beyond the borders of Millfield, setting in motion changes that would transform not just his own future, but the entire community. He'd spent his life serving. All he knew was that there were cars to fix, a daughter to support, and another day to navigate with the same grace and determination that had seen him through every challenge life had thrown his way. The rest, as he would soon discover, was about to take care of itself in ways he never could have imagined. The Tuesday that would change everything started with the sound Clarence Hall had been dreading for months, a grinding, metallic shriek that cut through the morning air like a rusty blade. He was under the hood of Mrs. Patterson's Buick, finally replacing the transmission filter that had been hanging on. Through sheer stubborn determination, when his main hydraulic lift let out, a groan that spoke of metal fatigue and imminent failure. Imminent failure. No, 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 Clarence muttered, hitting the lift's control button with perhaps more force than necessary. The ancient Benpack lift, which had been the backbone of his operation for nearly 2 decades, shuddered and wheezed but refused to lower Mrs. Patterson's car back to ground level. Instead, it hung suspended 8 feet in the air, swaying slightly like a 2-ton pendulum of automotive doom. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Riley looked up from the invoice she'd been updating at the front desk, her expression shifting from casual concern to genuine alarm as she recognized the sound. She'd grown up in this garage, and she knew the difference between machinery that was complaining and machinery that was dying. "Dad," she called, setting down her pen. "How bad is it?" Clarence wiped his hands on his shop rag, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing whenever he needed a moment to think. He walked around the lift, examining the hydraulic lines and listening to the irregular wheezing of the pump motor. 23 years of experience told him what his heart didn't want to accept. This wasn't a repair job. This was a replacement job, and replacement hydraulic lifts cost more money than Hall's roadside repair had seen in any single month since he'd opened the doors. "Well," he said finally, forcing his voice to remain steady, "it's not great. Sweetheart, the timing couldn't have been worse." Riley's college enrollment deadline was exactly 6 weeks away, and they were still $3,200 short of the funds needed to secure her spot in the engineering program. Clarence had been working 14-hour days, taking on every repair job he could find, even driving to neighboring towns to pick up work from other mechanics who were too busy to handle overflow customers. Every penny had been earmarked for Riley's future, which meant there was nothing left for equipment emergencies. "Can you fix it?" Riley asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Clarence knelt beside the lift's base unit, running his fingers along a hydraulic line that showed signs of metal fatigue near the connection point. The main cylinders cracked, and the pump motor's been working overtime trying to compensate. "I could patch it temporarily, maybe buy us a few weeks." But he stood up, brushing dust from his knees. "But it wouldn't be safe. Not with cars this heavy." The silence that followed was filled with the weight of unspoken mathematics. Without the lift, Clarence could only work on vehicles that could be serviced from ground level. Oil changes, tire rotations, basic maintenance, the major repair, work that paid the bills, the transmission jobs and exhaust system replacements that kept the lights on, would be impossible. And without that income, Riley's college fund would remain forever out of reach. "How much would a replacement cost?" Riley asked quietly. Clarence had been avoiding that particular calculation, but now he had no choice but to face it. "Used, if I could find one in decent condition. Maybe 12, 15,000. New." He shook his head. "We're talking about the price of a car." Riley absorbed this information with the same practical stoicism she'd inherited from her father. At 17, she'd already learned that life had a way of presenting challenges that couldn't be solved with hope alone. She walked over to the lift and placed her hand on its metal base, as if trying to will it back to health through sheer determination. "What about Mr. Garrison?" she suggested. "Didn't he say he might be interested in buying the garage?" Tom Garrison owned 3 auto dealerships in the county and had been making increasingly aggressive offers to purchase Hall's roadside repair over the past year. His interest wasn't in the business itself, but in the prime real estate. The property sat on nearly 2 acres of commercially zoned land that would be perfect for expanding his used car lot. His most recent offer had been generous enough to pay off the mortgage, fund Riley's education, and leave enough left over for Clarence to start fresh somewhere else. But starting fresh would mean leaving Millfield, abandoning the customers who depended on him, and walking away from the life he'd built with Sarah all those years ago. It would mean admitting that sometimes, despite your best efforts and strongest intentions, the numbers simply don't add up. "I'm not ready to give up yet," Clarence said. Though his voice lacked its usual conviction, the morning passed in a blur of phone calls and creative problem-solving. Clarence contacted every equipment dealer within 100 miles, searching for a used lift that might be within his price range. He called in favors from other mechanics, explored rental options, and even investigated whether it might be possible to reinforce the existing lift enough to make it functional for light-duty work. By noon, the reality was unavoidable. There was no magic solution, no hidden resource, no forgotten savings account that would solve this problem. The lift was dead, and replacing it would require resources that Hall's roadside repair simply didn't have. Riley spent her lunch break researching alternatives to the State University engineering program. Community college, perhaps, followed by a transfer after 2 years. It would delay her plans, but it would also cost significantly less. She didn't mention this research to her father, but he noticed her browsing college websites with a different focus than usual. "You know," Riley said as they shared a sandwich from the diner down the street, "Mrs. Morrison called while you were on the phone with the equipment place. Tommy's motorcycle is acting up again, and she wondered if you could take a look at it after school." Clarence nodded absently. Ground-level repairs only now. The scope of work he could accept had suddenly become much smaller, which meant their income was about to become much smaller as well. "Dad," Riley said carefully, "maybe it's time to consider Mr. Garrison's offer." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from an old exhaust pipe. Clarence looked around the garage that had been his life's work, taking in the carefully organized tools, the customer thank you cards, the hand-painted signs that Riley had made to brighten up the place. This building had witnessed Riley's first steps, her first attempts at holding a wrench, her first successful engine repair. It contained the echoes of every conversation he'd had with Sarah about their dreams for the future, every late-night session spent working on a customer's car because they needed it running for work the next morning. But it also contained the reality of their situation. Without major repair capabilities, the garage couldn't generate enough income to sustain itself, let alone fund Riley's education. And Riley's education was the most important thing in the world. "Let me think about it," Clarence said finally. As the afternoon wore on, the broken lift seemed to loom larger in the workspace, a constant reminder of how quickly circumstances could change. Customers called to schedule work that Clarence now had to decline. The Honda Civic that had purred so contentedly that morning sat finished and ready for pickup, but it would likely be one of the last major repairs Hall's roadside repair would complete. By closing time, father and daughter sat in the office sharing a dinner of leftover pizza and contemplating a future that looked very different from the one they'd imagined that morning. The radio played softly in the background, its familiar presence offering small comfort in the face of uncertainty. "You know what Mom would say about all this?" Riley asked, breaking a silence that had stretched for nearly an hour. Clarence looked up from the paperwork he'd been pretending to review. "What's that, sweetheart?" "She'd say that sometimes, when one door closes, another one opens. But you have to be brave enough to walk through it." It was exactly something Sarah would have said, delivered with the same quiet wisdom that had made her the strongest person Clarence had ever known. And hearing those words from Riley's lips reminded him that Sarah's legacy lived on in their daughter's unshakable faith, that tomorrow could be better than today, even when today felt like the end of the world. Outside, the sun was setting over Millfield, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the windows of the garage. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult decisions, and the possibility that everything they'd built together might have to change. But tonight, they still had each other, they still had hope, and sometimes, Clarence thought as he locked up the garage, that had to be enough. Wednesday morning brought news that felt like a second punch to an already bruised gut. Clarence stood in the cramped office of Hall's roadside repair, holding a certified letter that had arrived with the morning mail, its official letterhead and formal language delivering a message that would have been devastating under normal circumstances. Under current circumstances, it felt like watching a house burn down while standing in the rain. "Final notice of property tax delinquency," he read aloud. Though Riley had already seen the envelope and understood its implications, The letter informed him that Millfield County was prepared to begin foreclosure proceedings if the outstanding property taxes for $1,847.33 plus penalties and interest weren't paid within 30 days. Riley looked up from her calculus homework, her pencil frozen mid-equation. "I thought you paid the taxes in December." "Taxes in December. I paid half of them," Clarence admitted, sinking into the desk chair that had belonged to his father-in-law. "I was supposed to pay the balance by February 1st, but then the alternator went out on the tow truck, and Mrs. Patterson needed that transmission work done, and..." He trailed off, knowing that explaining the sequence of small financial decisions that had led to this moment wouldn't change the arithmetic. The property taxes had been on his mental list of things to handle as soon as business picked up. But business hadn't picked up. It had maintained its steady, modest pace, generating just enough income to cover daily expenses, while leaving nothing for the larger obligations that lurked in the background like patient predators. And now, with the hydraulic lift dead and their ability to take on major repair work effectively eliminated, there was no realistic path to generating the nearly $5,000 needed to satisfy the county's demand. "What happens if we can't pay?" Riley asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "The county can seize the property and sell it at auction to recover the tax debt." Clarence folded the letter and set it beside the stack of unpaid invoices that had been growing steadily over the past month. "Standard procedure. They're not trying to be cruel. They just need their revenue." Riley absorbed this information with the same quiet strength she'd shown the day before when the lift failed. At 17, she'd already learned that life rarely provided convenient timing for its challenges. But Clarence could see the weight accumulating in her shoulders, the way she held her pencil a little too tightly, the slight tremor in her voice when she spoke. "So we need $5,000 for the taxes, plus $15,000 for a new lift, plus the college money." She was doing the math, and the numbers painted a picture that no amount of optimism could improve. "Dad, that's more than we make in a year." It was exactly more than they made in a year. Hall's roadside repair generated approximately $18,000 in annual revenue. But after expenses, insurance, utilities, parts, supplies, living costs, their actual profit margin hovered somewhere around minimum wage. Clarence had been making it work through sheer persistence, and by accepting that, financial comfort was a luxury he couldn't afford. But this convergence of crises had moved beyond the realm of careful budgeting and delayed gratification. The morning brought a steady stream of phone calls that drove home their predicament. With painful clarity, Mrs. Patterson called to schedule the brake work her Buick desperately needed, only to have Clarence explain that he could no longer handle jobs requiring the lift. Tommy Morrison's mother called about transmission trouble with their family's Suburban, another job that would have provided a week's worth of income, now impossible to accept. Each declined job felt like watching money walk out the door, but more than that, it felt like failing the people who had trusted him to keep their vehicles running. These weren't customers who could easily take their business elsewhere. Mrs. Patterson lived on a fixed income that made the trip to the county seat financially challenging. The Morrison family was dealing with medical bills that left little room for expensive automotive repairs at the chain shops. By noon, Clarence had made a decision he'd been avoiding for weeks. He picked up the phone and dialed Tom Garrison's office, Hall's roadside. Garrison answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the casual confidence of someone who'd been expecting this call. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you. Your offer," Clarence said without preamble, "is it still on the table?" "Of course. Though I should mention that I've had to adjust it slightly downward to reflect current market conditions." The pause that followed felt calculated. "I'm thinking $45,000 for the property as is." Clarence felt the number hit like cold water. Garrison's previous offer had been $58,000, enough to pay off the mortgage, settle the tax debt, and leave a substantial amount for Riley's education. $45,000 would cover the mortgage and taxes, with perhaps $10,000 left over. Nowhere near enough for college expenses. "That's quite a reduction," Clarence said carefully. "Well, I've been doing some research on comparable properties, And frankly, the commercial real estate market isn't what it was last year. Plus, I'd be taking on the property tax liability, which affects my calculations. Garrison's tone remained friendly, but there was an undertone of inevitability. Of course, if you'd prefer to explore other options. They both knew there were no other options. No bank would approve a loan to a business owner facing property tax foreclosure. No equipment financing company would extend credit to someone who couldn't demonstrate stable income. The arithmetic was simple and unforgiving. I need some time to think about it, Clarence said. Of course, but I should mention that I'm looking at another property as well, so I can't hold this offer indefinitely. Let's say, end of the week. After hanging up, Clarence sat in the silent office for nearly an hour, staring at the framed photo of Sarah that sat beside the ancient computer monitor. She was laughing in the picture, her hair catching the sunlight, grease smudged on her cheek from helping him rebuild an engine in the early days of their marriage. She looked like someone who believed that every problem had a solution, if you were willing to work hard enough to find it. What would you do? He whispered to the photograph. Riley appeared in the doorway, her backpack slung over one shoulder. I'm going to walk to the library to work on that scholarship essay. Mrs. Henderson said I could use the computer there. Clarence looked up, noting the careful way his daughter was avoiding eye contact. Riley, about the college money, Dad. She stepped into the office and perched on the edge of the desk, her expression more mature than any 17-year-old should need to be. I've been thinking, maybe community college isn't such a bad idea. I could get my general education requirements out of the way, save money, and transfer to state as a junior. It would actually be smarter financially. The words were reasonable, practical, and completely heartbreaking. Clarence could see through them to the sacrifice his daughter was preparing to make, the dreams she was ready to defer to ease his burden. You shouldn't have to compromise your future because of my problems, he said. Riley smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like her mother. Dad, you've spent 17 years making sure I had everything I needed to succeed. Maybe it's time for me to help solve problems instead of just creating expenses. As she left for the library, Clarence remained in the office, surrounded by the accumulated weight of impossible decisions. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted through the bay doors of the garage, illuminating the broken hydraulic lift that stood like a monument to the way circumstances could change overnight. The radio played softly in the background, cycling through the same mix of classic rock and local advertisements that had provided the soundtrack too nearly to decades of work and worry. But today, even the familiar music felt different, like a goodbye song playing at the end of a long, difficult dance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new phone calls from customers he couldn't help, new reminders of how quickly a life's work could unravel when the foundation shifted. But tonight, Clarence Hall would close up his garage, walk upstairs to the small apartment he shared with his remarkable daughter, and try to figure out how to explain that sometimes, despite your best efforts and strongest intentions, love alone isn't enough to hold the world together. He didn't know that help was already on its way, driving through the gathering dusk toward Millfield in a car that would refuse to start at exactly the right moment, bringing with it possibilities he couldn't have imagined in his most optimistic dreams. Thursday afternoon arrived with the kind of October drizzle that made everything in Millfield look slightly blurred around the edges, as if the entire town had been painted with watercolors that hadn't quite dried. Clarence Hall stood in the open bay of his garage, watching the rain create small rivers in the gravel parking area, while he contemplated the impossible arithmetic of his situation. In 3 days, he would need to give Tom Garrison a final answer about selling the property. In 26 days, the county would begin foreclosure proceedings, and in 6 weeks, Riley's college enrollment deadline would pass, taking with it the future he'd spent 17 years working to provide. The sound of an engine in distress cut through his brooding like a knife through silk. It wasn't the familiar wheeze of Mrs. Patterson's Buick or the irregular idle of Tommy Morrison's motorcycle. This was something different, the smooth purr of a finely tuned motor suddenly interrupted by the metallic cough that every mechanic recognizes as the sound of expensive machinery about to become very expensive problems. A sleek black Mercedes-Benz E-Class sedan appeared through the rain, its headlights cutting through the gray afternoon as it coasted into the gravel lot in front of Hall's roadside repair. Even in the dim light, Clarence could see that this wasn't a vehicle that typically found its way to his humble garage. The paint gleamed despite the rain. The chrome trim caught what little sunlight managed to penetrate the clouds, and the low profile tires suggested a price tag that could fund Riley's entire college education. The engine coughed once more, then died completely. For a moment, nothing happened. The Mercedes sat in the drizzle like a sleeping panther, its dark silhouette elegant even in distress. Then the driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out into the rain with the kind of careful grace that suggested expensive shoes and an unwillingness to let weather dictate her movements. She was perhaps 45 years old, with auburn hair pulled back in a style that managed to look both professional and effortless. Her charcoal wool coat was tailored perfectly, and her leather handbag probably cost more than Clarence made in a month. But it was her expression that caught his attention, not the imperious frustration he might have expected from someone driving a car worth more than most people's houses, but a look of genuine concern mixed with something that might have been embarrassment. Clarence grabbed his shop coat from the hook beside the bay door and walked out to meet her, raindrops immediately speckling his glasses and dampening his graying hair. "Car trouble?" he asked, though the answer was obvious enough. She looked up at him with eyes the color of coffee with just a hint of cream, and when she spoke, her voice carried a slight accent that suggested education and travel. "I'm afraid so. It just stopped right here in your parking lot. Actually, sometimes they know where to find help," Clarence said with a smile, pulling his collar up against the drizzle. "I'm Clarence Hall. This is my place, Phoebe Collins," she replied, extending a hand that felt smaller than he'd expected, but with a grip that suggested confidence. "I don't suppose you have experience with European vehicles." Clarence walked around the Mercedes, his trained eye taking in details that most people would miss. The car was immaculate, clearly well-maintained, with the kind of subtle modifications that spoke of someone who understood automotive excellence. But there were also small signs of extensive travel: road dust in the wheel wells, tiny stone chips on the lower bumper, the slight wear on the door handle that came from frequent use. "Depends on what's wrong with it," he said. "Mind if I take a look under the hood?" Phoebe hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. "Of course, though I should warn you, I'm not exactly in familiar territory here. I was driving through, trying to make it to the county seat, when..." She gestured helplessly at the silent vehicle. Clarence popped the hood and immediately felt the familiar satisfaction of confronting a puzzle that existed entirely within his area of expertise. The Mercedes engine bay was a work of art, every component precisely placed, every surface clean enough to eat from, every wire and hose arranged with the kind of Germanic precision that made American engines look like abstract sculpture. But even works of art could fail, and this one had failed in a way that made Clarence's experienced eyes narrow with interest. "When did you last have the fuel system serviced?" he asked, running his fingers along a series of connections near the fuel rail. "I'm not sure," Phoebe admitted. "My regular mechanic handles all of that. I just drive the car." Clarence nodded, understanding completely. Most people related to their vehicles the way they related to their televisions or microwaves. They expected them to work, and when they didn't, they found someone to make them work again. "Your fuel pump's given up," he said after a few minutes of careful investigation. "It's not getting power to the motor. Could be the relay, could be the pump itself, could be a wiring issue." He straightened up, wiping his hands on his shop rag. "The good news is, it's probably fixable. The less good news is, parts for a car like this, money's not really a concern," Phoebe said quickly, then seemed to catch herself. "I mean, within reason, of course. I just need it running again." Clarence studied her face, noting the way she'd corrected herself, the slight tension around her eyes when she mentioned money. In his experience, people who genuinely weren't concerned about money rarely felt the need to say so. "Well, let's start with diagnosis and go from there," he said. "I can probably have an answer for you by tomorrow morning. There's a decent motel about 10 miles up the road, or if you'd prefer, the county seat has more options. Phoebe glanced around at the town of Millfield, taking in the modest houses, the quiet streets, the general air of a place where nothing much happened and most people preferred it that way. "Actually," she said, "is there somewhere in town I could stay? I'm not in a particular hurry, and I'd rather not drive any farther than necessary." "Henderson's boarding house," Clarence said. Without hesitation, Mrs. Henderson runs a clean place, serves a good breakfast, and she's reasonable about rates. It's just 2 blocks down Main Street, the big white house with the green shutters. As he spoke, Riley appeared in the garage doorway, attracted by the unusual sight of an expensive car in their parking lot. She waved tentatively, and Phoebe waved back with a smile that seemed genuine. "Your daughter?" Phoebe asked. "Riley. She's 17. Thinks she knows everything, and unfortunately, she's usually right." The pride in Clarence's voice was unmistakable. "She has your eyes," Phoebe observed, then seemed to realize she was revealing more personal attention than might be appropriate for a casual encounter with a stranger. Clarence felt something shift in the conversation, a subtle deepening that went beyond the usual customer-mechanic relationship. There was something about Phoebe Collins that didn't quite fit the picture of a wealthy woman whose car had inconveniently broken down. Something in the way she looked at his garage, at Riley, at him, as if she were evaluating more than just his mechanical skills. "I'll need to order the part," he said, bringing the conversation back to practical matters. "Might take a day or two to get here, depending on availability." Phoebe reached into her handbag and pulled out a wallet that was elegant, but not ostentatious. "Will 200 cover the diagnosis and getting started?" It was more than Clarence typically charged for diagnostic work, but he wasn't about to argue with someone who seemed eager to pay fairly for his services. He nodded and watched as she counted out crisp bills with the casual ease of someone accustomed to carrying substantial amounts of cash. "I'll call you at Henderson's as soon as I know something," he promised. As Phoebe walked away into the drizzle, her heels clicking against the wet asphalt with a rhythm that seemed oddly musical, Clarence found himself watching until she disappeared around the corner onto Main Street. There was something about her that lingered in his mind, a sense that this chance encounter might be more significant than the simple matter of a broken fuel pump. Riley appeared beside him, following his gaze down the empty street. "Fancy car," she observed. "Fancy everything," Clarence replied. "But nice, though," she seemed. "I don't know, real," Clarence nodded, though he wasn't sure what Riley meant by that. All he knew was that for the first time in days, he had work that would pay well, and for the moment, that was enough. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, he would have something productive to focus on besides impossible mathematics and heartbreaking decisions he didn't yet understand. That Phoebe Collins represented more than just a temporary reprieve from his financial worries. He couldn't have known that her broken-down Mercedes was about to become the catalyst for changes that would transform not just his own life, but the entire community of Millfield in ways he'd never dared to imagine. Friday morning dawned, clear and crisp, the kind of October day that made Millfield look like a postcard from a simpler time. Clarence arrived at the garage before sunrise, as was his habit, but today he moved with a purpose that had been missing for weeks. The Mercedes sat in his parking lot like a sleeping promise, and for the first time since the hydraulic lift had failed, he had work that would both challenge his skills and provide meaningful income. Riley was already at the front desk when he unlocked the office, a steaming cup of coffee from the diner in one hand and her calculus textbook in the other. She developed the habit of arriving early to catch up on homework before the day's distractions began, but Clarence suspected she also enjoyed the quiet morning hours they shared before the world intruded. "Did you figure out what's wrong with the fancy car?" she asked, looking up from a problem involving derivatives and optimization. "Fuel pump, just like I thought, but it's more complicated than that." Clarence poured himself coffee from the pot that had been brewing since 5:30. "The pump's fine, but the control module that tells it when to run has given up. It's not a part you can find at the local auto store." Riley closed her textbook and gave him her full attention. "Expensive. The part's about $400, plus shipping. But the real challenge is going to be the installation. These European cars, everything's integrated. I'll need to access the vehicle's computer system to program the new module. Clarence sat down across from her, cradling his coffee mug between his hands. It's the kind of work I used to do all the time, before everything became so computerized. But you can do it, Clarence smiled, feeling the familiar confidence that came with tackling a problem squarely within his expertise. I can do it, might take me a little longer than it would take someone with the fancy diagnostic equipment. But I can do it. But I can do it. At 8:30, Phoebe Collins appeared in the doorway of the garage, dressed more casually than the day before in dark jeans, a cream-colored sweater, and boots that looked both practical and expensive. She carried a paper bag from the diner and a cardboard tray with 3 cups of coffee. I thought you might not have had breakfast, she said, setting the bag on Clarence's workbench. And I wasn't sure how you take your coffee, so I brought cream and sugar. Riley looked up from her homework with an expression of pleasant surprise. That's really nice of you. It's the least I can do, Phoebe replied. I know having a broken down car taking up space isn't ideal for a working garage. Clarence accepted the coffee gratefully, noting that she'd remembered to bring one for Riley as well. It was a small gesture, but it spoke to a level of thoughtfulness that went beyond typical customer courtesy. Any word on the part? Phoebe asked, settling onto the spare stool that served as their informal customer seating. Ordered it from a supplier in Chicago. Should be here Monday morning, Tuesday at the latest. Clarence opened the paper bag and found fresh-baked cinnamon rolls that were still warm. They're shipping it overnight, but the weekend slows things down, Phoebe nodded, seeming genuinely unconcerned about the delay. That works fine for me. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house is quite comfortable, and frankly, it's been nice to slow down for a few days. Riley looked up with curiosity. Are you traveling for work? Something like that, Phoebe said, then seemed to realize the vagueness of her answer. I'm between projects at the moment, taking some time to figure out what comes next. Clarence found himself studying her face as she spoke, noting the way her eyes seemed to carry the weight of experiences she wasn't ready to share. There was a story there, he sensed. Something more complex than a simple business trip interrupted by car trouble. What kind of work do you do? Riley asked with the direct curiosity of someone who hadn't yet learned that. Some questions were better left unasked. Phoebe hesitated for just a moment. Business consulting. Helping companies figure out how to run more efficiently, solve problems, that sort of thing. It was a perfectly reasonable answer, but something in her tone suggested there was more to it than she was revealing. Clarence filed the observation away without pursuing it. He'd learned long ago that customers often had their reasons for privacy, and it wasn't his job to pry into their personal business. Must be interesting work, he said, getting to see how different businesses operate. It can be, Phoebe agreed, though sometimes the most interesting businesses are the ones that don't think they need consulting. She gestured around the garage, taking in the organized tools, the customer thank you cards, the general atmosphere of competence and care. Places like this, for instance, everything runs smoothly because someone who knows what they're doing has been paying attention to details for years. Clarence felt himself flush slightly at the compliment. Well, it's not exactly rocket science. You take care of people, they take care of you. That's more rare than you might think, Phoebe said quietly. As the morning progressed, Clarence found himself working while Phoebe observed from a respectful distance. She didn't hover or ask constant questions, but she seemed genuinely interested in watching him diagnose the Mercedes electrical system, using equipment that was probably older than Riley. That's quite a setup, she commented, watching him connect a multimeter to a series of wires beneath the dashboard. It's not pretty, but it works, Clarence replied, adjusting the meter's settings with the practiced movements of someone who'd performed this routine thousands of times. The fancy shops have computers that can talk directly to the car's brain, tell them exactly what's wrong and how to fix it. I have to do it the old-fashioned way, actually understand how the systems work. Phoebe leaned closer, watching the meter's display change as Clarence tested different circuits. And you learned all this? Trade school, mostly. Then 25 years of making mistakes and figuring out how not to make them again. Clarence smiled, remembering his younger self-confidence that formal training had prepared him for every possible scenario. The real education comes from the cars that don't read the manual. Dad's being modest. Riley interjected from her perch at the front desk. He can fix anything with wheels. People bring him cars that other mechanics have given up on. Is that right? Phoebe's tone carried genuine interest, not the polite engagement Clarence often heard from customers who were simply making conversation. While waiting, Riley's biased, Clarence said, though he couldn't suppress a smile. But I do okay. He does better than okay, a new voice called from the garage entrance. Mrs. Patterson stood there with her keys in hand, looking apologetic. I'm sorry to interrupt, but my Buick's making that noise again, and I was hoping. Clarence straightened up, wiping his hands on his shop rag. Of course, Mrs. Patterson. Though I should mention, I'm still having trouble with the lift, so I can only work on problems I can reach from ground level. Mrs. Patterson's face fell slightly. Oh, well, the noise is coming from underneath somewhere. It's gotten worse since Tuesday. Phoebe watched this exchange with keen attention, noting the genuine concern in Clarence's expression and the obvious trust Mrs. Patterson placed in his judgment. Tell you what, Clarence said after a moment's thought. Let me finish up what I'm doing here, and then I'll take a listen. Might be something I can diagnose without getting underneath. Mrs. Patterson's relief was visible. Oh, thank you, Clarence. I know you're busy, but I just don't know who else to ask. After Mrs. Patterson left, promising to return in an hour, Phoebe remained quietly thoughtful. Friend of yours? She asked. Customer. But yeah, I suppose friend too. Clarence returned his attention to the Mercedes wiring. That's how it works in a town this size. People aren't just customers, they're neighbors. And you can't help her because of the lift. Clarence nodded, feeling the familiar weight of frustration. Most of the work I do requires getting underneath the car. Without the lift, I'm limited to what I can reach from above or from the side. What happened to it? Age, mostly. 20 years of hard use, and it finally gave up. He didn't mention the financial impossibility of replacing it, but something in his tone must have conveyed the larger implications. Phoebe absorbed this information thoughtfully, her gaze moving from the broken lift to the organized tools to the customer thank you cards on the wall. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, as if she were evaluating something beyond the immediate conversation. You know, she said carefully, in my consulting work, I've seen a lot of businesses struggle with equipment issues. Sometimes there are solutions that aren't immediately obvious. Clarence looked up from his work, meeting her eyes directly, such as equipment leasing, cooperative purchasing arrangements, things like that. Sometimes businesses can pool resources in ways that make expensive equipment more affordable. It wasn't the first time Clarence had considered such possibilities. But coming from someone who claimed expertise in business consulting, the suggestion carried more weight. That's an interesting idea, he said, though around here, most of the other mechanics are dealing with their own challenges. Phoebe nodded thoughtfully but didn't pursue the topic further. Instead, she settled back on her stool and continued watching him work, her presence somehow both unobtrusive and oddly comforting. As the morning stretched toward noon, Clarence found himself wondering about the woman who'd brought her expensive car to his humble garage and seemed content to spend her morning watching him work with equipment that belonged in a museum. There was something about Phoebe Collins that didn't quite add up, but whatever her story, she was the most interesting thing that had happened to Hall's roadside repair in months. Over the weekend, Phoebe Collins became a fixture at Hall's roadside repair in a way that surprised everyone, including herself. Saturday morning found her arriving with coffee and pastries from the diner, settling onto her usual stool with a book and the air of someone who had nowhere more important to be. By Sunday afternoon, she was handing Clarence tools and asking Riley about her college plans with the easy familiarity of someone who'd been part of their lives for months rather than days. You don't have to spend your whole weekend in a garage, Clarence said as he worked on Tommy Morrison's motorcycle, which had developed a concerning rattle in the engine timing. Millfield's not exactly a tourist destination, but there are prettier places to pass the time. Phoebe looked up from the business management book she'd been reading, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Actually, this is exactly where I want to be. It's been years since I've had the luxury of watching someone who genuinely loves their work. Riley glanced up from her chemistry homework, which she'd spread across the front counter alongside a half-eaten sandwich. Dad does love it, even when the customers drive him crazy. I heard that. Clarence called from beneath the motorcycle's engine housing. And Mrs. Patterson doesn't drive me crazy. She's just thorough in her questions. She asked you 12 times if you were sure the brake pads would last through winter. Riley pointed out, because brake pads are important, Phoebe interjected with surprising authority. You don't take chances with stopping power, especially in weather conditions that require quick reactions. Both Clarence and Riley turned to look at her, and Phoebe seemed to realize she'd revealed more automotive knowledge than her story of being simply a business consultant would typically explain. My father was particular about car maintenance, she said quickly. I learned early that some things you don't compromise on. Clarence filed away this small inconsistency along with several others he'd noticed over the past few days. The way Phoebe had instinctively reached for the correct size wrench when he'd been struggling to reach it. The casual comment she'd made about fuel injection systems that revealed deeper understanding than most people possessed. The expensive handbag that somehow always contained exactly the right amount of cash for whatever situation arose. But rather than making him suspicious, these glimpses of hidden knowledge made him curious. Phoebe Collins was clearly more than she appeared to be, but whatever her story, she treated Riley with genuine warmth and spoke to him with the respect of someone who understood the value of skilled work. What did your father do? Riley asked, apparently unaware of the slight tension her question created. Phoebe hesitated, her fingers tightening almost imperceptibly around her coffee cup. He worked in the automotive industry, manufacturing, mostly. He always said that understanding how things were built helped you understand how to maintain them. It was another carefully vague answer, but delivered with enough personal detail to feel authentic. Clarence found himself wondering what Phoebe Collins was hiding, and more importantly, why she felt the need to hide it. Sunday afternoon brought unexpected insight into that question when Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house stopped by with fresh apple pie and a knowing smile. Thought you folks might enjoy some dessert, she said, setting the pie on Clarence's workbench with the satisfaction of someone who'd found the perfect excuse to satisfy her curiosity. And I wanted to thank Miss Collins for the generous donation to our church's food pantry. Phoebe looked genuinely startled. Mrs. Henderson, that was supposed to be anonymous. Anonymous donations of $500 don't stay secret long in a town this size, dear. Mrs. Henderson replied with gentle amusement, especially when they come from someone staying in our humble boarding house. After Mrs. Henderson left, carrying with her enough gossip to fuel a week's worth of coffee shop conversations, an awkward silence settled over the garage. $500 was more than many families in Millfield spent on groceries in a month, and the casual nature of Phoebe's generosity raised obvious questions about her true financial circumstances. That was really generous, Riley said finally, her voice carefully neutral. Phoebe shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. The food pantry serves a lot of families. It seemed like a good cause. It is, Clarence agreed, studying her face. Though $500 is substantial for most people. I've been fortunate in my business dealings, Phoebe said, then seemed to realize how that sounded coming from someone who described herself as being between projects. I mean, I've saved carefully over the years. Another inconsistency, another small mystery. But watching the way Phoebe interacted with Riley, seeing the genuine pleasure she took in simple conversations about homework and dreams and daily life, Clarence found himself caring less about what she was hiding, and more about why she'd chosen to share this time with them. You mentioned you were figuring out what comes next, Riley said as they shared Mrs. Henderson's pie. Are you thinking about changing careers? Phoebe was quiet for a long moment, staring out through the garage's open bay doors at the street, where Sunday afternoon in Millfield unfolded at its characteristic unhurried pace. Something like that, she said finally. I've spent most of my adult life building things that were supposed to matter, but somehow lost track of what actually does matter. She looked directly at Riley. "Watching you to this weekend, seeing how you take care of each other and your customers, it's reminded me of things I'd forgotten." Riley beamed at the compliment, but Clarence heard something deeper in Phoebe's words, the tone of someone who'd achieved conventional success but found it hollow, the weariness of someone who'd built a life that looked impressive from the outside but felt empty from within. "What kind of things?" Riley asked with the directness that was her trademark. Phoebe smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "That work should be about more than profit margins. That success isn't just about what you accumulate, but about what you contribute. That the best businesses aren't the ones with the biggest revenues, but the ones that make people's lives better." She gestured around the garage, taking in the thank you cards from customers, the organized tools, the general atmosphere of purposeful activity. "Your father has built something real here, something that matters to people in ways that can't be measured on a balance sheet." Clarence felt himself flush with unexpected emotion. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken about his work with such understanding, such respect for what he was trying to accomplish beyond simply making a living. "It's not much," he said quietly. "It's everything," Phoebe replied with conviction. "It's exactly what the world needs more of." As the afternoon wore on, Clarence found himself sharing stories he rarely told, about the early days of the garage, about Riley's mother and the dreams they'd built together, about the satisfaction of keeping people's cars running and the frustration of never having quite enough resources to do everything he wanted to do. Phoebe listened with the kind of attention that made speaking feel less like conversation and more like confession. She asked thoughtful questions, offered insights that revealed both intelligence and empathy, and somehow managed to make Clarence feel like his modest operation was worthy of respect rather than pity. "You know," she said as the sun began to set over Millfield, painting the garage in warm amber light, "I've consulted for companies worth billions of dollars, and most of them don't understand their customers half as well as you understand yours." It was a casual comment, delivered without apparent thought, but it revealed more about Phoebe's background than anything else she'd said. Companies worth billions didn't typically hire small-time business consultants. They hired people from major firms, people with impressive credentials and substantial reputations, people, Clarence realized, exactly like the woman who was currently helping Riley organize his tool inventory, with the efficiency of someone who understood complex systems. As they closed up the garage that evening, Clarence found himself looking forward to Monday morning in a way he hadn't experienced in months. Not just because the Mercedes part would arrive and he'd have challenging, well-paid work to complete, but because Phoebe Collins would be there to see him do it. He didn't yet understand that her presence in his garage was about to transform from a pleasant interlude into something that would change everything he thought he knew about possibility, opportunity, and the unexpected ways that help can arrive exactly when it's needed most. Monday morning brought the Mercedes part along with an unexpected confession that would shift the entire dynamic between Clarence Hall and the woman who'd been quietly occupying his thoughts for 5 days straight. The delivery truck arrived at 8:30 sharp, carrying the fuel pump control module that would restore Phoebe's car to working order. Clarence signed for the package with mixed feelings, relief that he could complete the repair, but also an odd sense of loss at the thought of Phoebe Collins continuing her journey to wherever business consultants went when their cars were fixed. Phoebe appeared shortly after the delivery truck departed, carrying her usual offering of coffee and pastries, but wearing an expression that suggested more than casual interest in the day's proceedings. "The part arrived," Clarence announced, holding up the small electronic component that had cost more than he typically made in a week. "Excellent," Phoebe replied, though her tone lacked the enthusiasm he'd expected. "How long will the installation take?" "Most of the day, probably. These control modules need to be programmed to match your car's specific systems. It's precise work." Clarence set the part carefully on his workbench. "You don't need to hang around for all of it. I know you've probably got places to be." Phoebe was quiet for a moment, staring at the Mercedes as if it represented something more complicated than simple transportation. "Actually," she said slowly, "I was hoping we could talk while you work. There are some things I should tell you." Riley looked up from her morning homework with obvious curiosity, but Phoebe shook her head gently. "This is probably a conversation for adults," she said kindly, "though maybe we could all have lunch together afterward." Riley nodded with the understanding of someone who'd learned to recognize when grown-ups needed privacy for serious discussions. She gathered her books and announced she'd be at the library until noon, working on her scholarship essays. After Riley left, Phoebe settled onto her customary stool while Clarence began the methodical process of accessing the Mercedes fuel system. For several minutes, they worked in comfortable silence, him removing panels and connections with practiced efficiency, her watching with the focused attention she'd shown all weekend. "I haven't been entirely honest with you," Phoebe said finally, her voice carrying the weight of someone approaching a confession they'd been avoiding. Clarence's hands paused briefly in their work, but he didn't look up. "I figured as much." "What gave me away?" "Lots of little things. The way you knew about brake pad specifications. The fact that you carry more cash than most people see in a month. The comment about consulting for billion-dollar companies." He straightened up, meeting her eyes directly. "Plus, business consultants between projects don't usually make $500 anonymous donations to small-town food pantries." Phoebe smiled ruefully. "I was never very good at being subtle." "So who are you really?" Phoebe took a deep breath, as if preparing to jump from a significant height. "My name is Phoebe Collins. That part's true. But I'm not a business consultant." She paused, seeming to gather courage. "I'm the CEO of Hartwell Automotive Group. We own 47 dealerships across the Midwest, 3 parts distribution centers, and a specialty restoration shop that works on classic cars." Clarence absorbed this information with the calm acceptance of someone who'd already suspected the truth was more complex than the story he'd been told. "Hartwell," he repeated. "I've seen your commercials, where automotive dreams come true. That's us." Phoebe's tone carried a mixture of pride and weariness. "Third-generation family business. My grandfather started with a single Ford dealership in 1952. My father expanded throughout the region, and she trailed off, staring at her hands. And you built it into something bigger." Clarence finished. "I built it into something more profitable," Phoebe corrected. "Whether that makes it bigger or just more complicated is a question I've been asking myself a lot lately." Clarence returned to his work on the Mercedes, giving her space to continue the story at her own pace. He'd learned over the years that people often revealed more when they didn't feel pressured to explain themselves. 6 months ago, I had what my doctor politely called a stress-related incident," Phoebe continued. "What normal people would call a breakdown. I was working 18-hour days, sleeping for hours a night, and treating everything in my life like a problem to be optimized for maximum efficiency." She gestured around the garage, taking in the hand-painted signs, the thank you cards, the general atmosphere of unhurried competence. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to be in a place where work was about more than quarterly earnings reports and market share analysis." "So you decided to take a road trip." "I decided to remember why I fell in love with cars in the first place." Phoebe's voice grew softer, more personal. "My father taught me to change oil when I was 12. By 16, I could rebuild a carburetor. When I graduated from business school, I thought I'd combine my love of automobiles with my head for numbers and build something meaningful. And instead, I built something successful. There's a difference, as it turns out." Clarence nodded, understanding completely. He'd seen plenty of businesses that optimized for profit at the expense of purpose, that treated customers as revenue sources rather than people with actual needs. "What happened to your stress-related incident?" he asked gently. "I collapsed during a board meeting while discussing the cost-effectiveness of closing 3 of our smaller dealerships." Phoebe's laugh held no humor. "I was arguing that we could increase profitability by 5% if we eliminated locations that served fewer than 200 customers per month. I kept talking about efficiency and optimization until my assistant called an ambulance." Clarence could picture the scene: a high-stakes conference room, expensive suits, charts and graphs, and a woman pushing herself past all reasonable limits in pursuit of numbers that looked good on paper but ignored the human cost of business decisions. The doctor said I needed to step back, reduce stress, reconnect with whatever made me passionate about my work in the first place. She smiled at Clarence, so I got in my car and started driving, with no particular destination in mind, just looking for something that felt real. And you found it in a broken-down garage, in the middle of nowhere. I found it watching you explain to Mrs. Patterson why her brake pads were more important than saving $50. I found it listening to Riley talk about engineering school with the kind of excitement I used to feel about automotive innovation. I found it in the way you treat every customer like they matter, even when they can't afford to pay what your time is actually worth. Clarence felt himself flush with unexpected emotion. It's just how business should be done. That's exactly my point, Phoebe said with intensity. It should be, but it usually isn't. I've been so focused on making Hartwell Automotive more profitable that I forgot what we were supposed to be profiting from: helping people maintain reliable transportation, supporting communities, being part of something larger than just quarterly revenue targets. As the morning progressed, their conversation deepened into territory that Clarence rarely explored with anyone, even his closest friends. He found himself talking about Sarah's death, about the challenges of raising Riley alone, about the daily struggle to balance providing for his daughter with being present for her life. She would have been an incredible engineer, he said, adjusting a connection in the Mercedes fuel system. Sarah, she understood mechanical systems in ways that most people never do. Riley gets that from her, and the determination to fix things that everyone else has given up on, that she gets from both of us, I think. Phoebe was quiet for a moment, watching him work with the careful attention she'd shown all week. Clarence, she said finally, can I ask you something? Of course. If money weren't a factor, if you could expand this place, hire help, get the equipment you need, what would you build? The question caught him off guard. It had been so long since he'd allowed himself to think in terms of possibilities, rather than limitations, that he almost didn't know how to answer. I'd want to create something that served the whole community, he said slowly, the vision taking shape as he spoke. Not just car repairs, but automotive education, teaching young people trades that would give them good careers, maybe a program for single parents who need reliable transportation but can't afford dealer prices. His voice grew stronger as the dream became more vivid. I'd want to be the kind of place where people felt like they were getting honest advice, fair prices, and work they could trust, where the focus was always on what was best for the customer, not what was most profitable for the business. Phoebe nodded thoughtfully, as if filing away every word for future reference. That sounds exactly like the kind of business the world needs more of, she said. As noon approached and Riley's return from the library drew near, Clarence found himself hoping that completing the Mercedes repair wouldn't mark the end of his conversations with Phoebe Collins. She'd reminded him of possibilities he'd almost forgotten, dreams he'd set aside in the daily struggle to keep his head above water. He didn't yet realize that their conversation had been more than just mutual sharing of personal history. He couldn't have known that every word had been carefully evaluated by someone who'd spent her career identifying opportunities for strategic investment, and who was beginning to see possibilities that would transform not just his modest garage, but the entire landscape of what automotive businesses could become. The Mercedes repair progressed smoothly throughout the afternoon, but it was the phone calls that began to reveal the true scope of Phoebe Collins' world. The first came at 1:30, just as Clarence was completing the fuel pump module installation. Phoebe's phone rang with a tone that seemed oddly formal, and she glanced at the display with an expression that suggested this wasn't a call she could ignore. "Excuse me," she said, stepping outside the garage bay. "I need to take this through the open doors." Clarence could hear fragments of a conversation that sounded nothing like the casual exchanges of someone between consulting projects. Terms like quarterly projections, acquisition timeline, and board approval drifted back into the garage, spoken in a tone of authority that suggested Phoebe Collins was accustomed to making decisions that affected substantial amounts of money. Riley, who had returned from the library with a submarine sandwich and renewed focus on her calculus homework, looked up with obvious curiosity. "She sounds busy for someone who's supposed to be taking a break," she observed quietly. Clarence nodded. continuing his work while trying not to appear too interested in the conversation happening just outside. But when Phoebe mentioned something about the Henderson acquisition moving forward faster than anticipated and liquidating the Milwaukee properties to fund the expansion, he found himself wondering exactly how large Hartwell Automotive Group actually was. The second call came an hour later, and this one revealed even more intriguing details. Phoebe answered with crisp professionalism, but her side of the conversation included references to the Foundation's educational initiatives and increasing our scholarship funding by another $2 million for next fiscal year. Riley's eyes widened. Did she just say $2 million? Clarence had heard it too, and the casual way Phoebe discussed such amounts suggested they were routine, rather than exceptional. When she returned to the garage, her expression was apologetic but distracted. "Sorry about the interruptions," she said. "Sometimes the business world doesn't respect vacation time. $2 million worth of scholarship funding doesn't sound like vacation-level business," Riley said with characteristic directness. Phoebe paused, seeming to realize she'd revealed more than intended. "The Hartwell Foundation supports automotive education programs. It's one of our larger initiatives." "How large?" Clarence asked, looking up from the diagnostic computer he'd connected to the Mercedes. "We fund full scholarships for about 300 students annually, plus partial support for another 500. Phoebe's tone suggested these numbers were so familiar they required no particular thought. Automotive technology programs, mechanical engineering, business administration with automotive focus. Riley set down her pencil completely. That's more than my entire high school's annual budget." "Education is important," Phoebe said simply, though something in her expression suggested the topic made her uncomfortable. The third call proved to be the most revealing. It came at 3:15, just as Clarence was preparing to test the Mercedes' repaired fuel system. This time, Phoebe didn't step outside. Instead, she answered with a weary sigh that suggested the caller's timing was particularly inconvenient. "What? Do you mean they're accelerating the timeline?" she said without preamble. "I thought we agreed nothing moves forward until I'm back in the office." Clarence tried to focus on his work, but the conversation was impossible to ignore. "No, absolutely not. I don't care what the lawyers say about market conditions. We are not moving forward with the Riverside acquisition until I've had a chance to review the community impact assessment." Phoebe's voice carried an edge of steel that hadn't been present in any of their casual conversations. Riley and Clarence exchanged glances. Riverside was barely 30 miles away, and if Hartwell Automotive was considering acquisitions there, it suggested a level of regional influence that went far beyond what either of them had imagined. "Because I said so, that's why," Phoebe continued. "And before you remind me that I'm supposed to be on leave, let me remind you that I'm still the CEO of this company. Nothing happens without my approval, especially when it involves closing down existing businesses to make room for our operations." She listened for a moment, her expression growing increasingly frustrated. "I don't care if it would increase our market penetration by 15%. Some things are more important than market penetration." Her eyes flicked toward Clarence, who was pretending to be absorbed in checking fuel pressure readings. "We're not in the business of destroying communities for the sake of quarterly growth." After ending the call, Phoebe sat in silence for several minutes, staring at her phone as if it represented everything she was trying to escape. "Everything okay?" Clarence asked carefully. "My company wants to buy out several independent auto repair shops in the area and replace them with branded quick service centers." Phoebe's voice was flat, professional, more efficient, better profit margins, standardized customer experience. "And you don't think that's a good idea?" Phoebe looked around the garage, taking in the thank you cards, the hand-painted signs, the general atmosphere of personal care that couldn't be replicated through corporate standardization. "I used to think efficiency was the highest virtue in business," she said slowly. "But this week has reminded me that some things can't be efficiently replaced." Riley, who had been listening with growing understanding, spoke up. "You're talking about places like this, aren't you? Independent shops that know their customers personally." "Exactly like this." Phoebe's admission carried the weight of someone confronting an uncomfortable truth. Hartwell's business model is based on consolidation, standardization, economies of scale. We acquire smaller operations, modernize them, and integrate them into our corporate structure, which eliminates competition, Clarence observed. Which eliminates inefficiency, Phoebe corrected, though her tone suggested she was no longer entirely convinced by her own words. At least, that's how I've always justified it. The fourth call came at 4:30, and this one was different from the others. Instead of answering immediately, Phoebe stared at the display for several rings before finally accepting the call. "Hello, Margaret," she said, her tone suddenly warmer but tinged with guilt. Clarence couldn't hear the other side of this conversation, but Phoebe's responses painted a picture of someone trying to reassure a worried colleague or friend. "Yes, I know I missed the quarterly review meeting. Yes, I understand that the board is concerned about my extended absence." She walked toward the far end of the garage, lowering her voice. "No, I'm not having another breakdown. I'm just thinking." The conversation continued for nearly 10 minutes, with Phoebe's responses revealing increasing tension between her current location and the expectations of her corporate responsibilities. "Margaret, I need you to trust me on this. What I'm doing right now is important for the company's future, even if I can't explain it yet." She paused, listening. "Just tell the board that I'm conducting field research on market opportunities in underserved communities." After ending the call, Phoebe returned to find Clarence completing the final diagnostic tests on her Mercedes. The car's engine purred, with the smooth confidence of German engineering restored to full health. "All finished," he announced. "She's running perfectly now." Phoebe stared at the repaired vehicle for a long moment, and Clarence could see conflicting emotions playing across her face. Relief at having reliable transportation again, but also something that looked remarkably like reluctance. "What do I owe you?" she asked quietly. Clarence calculated parts, labor, and diagnostic time, arriving at a figure that represented several days of typical income. $850. Phoebe reached into her handbag and counted out $900 bills without apparent effort, the casual display of such amounts reinforcing everything the afternoon's phone calls had suggested about her financial resources. "Keep the change," she said, "and thank you for everything." Riley looked between the two adults, sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand, but recognizing that something significant was concluding. "Are you leaving?" she asked. Phoebe hesitated, her hand resting on the Mercedes door handle. "I should. My company needs me back, and I've probably imposed on your father's hospitality long enough." But she didn't get into the car. Instead, she stood there in the late afternoon sunlight, looking around the garage as if trying to memorize every detail. "Phoebe," Clarence said carefully, "whatever you're really doing here, whatever you're thinking about, I hope you know that this week has meant a lot to us." She turned to look at him directly, and for a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "It's meant a lot to me too," she said, "more than you know." As the sun began to set over Millfield, casting long shadows across the garage floor, Clarence found himself hoping that Phoebe Collins wasn't quite ready to return to her world of quarterly reports and acquisition timelines. There was still something unfinished between them, some conversation that needed to happen before she drove away in her perfectly repaired Mercedes. He didn't yet understand that Phoebe had no intention of simply driving away. The phone calls, the reluctance to leave, the careful questions about his dreams for the garage, all of it had been leading toward a moment that would transform his understanding of what was possible when someone with real resources decided to invest in something that mattered more than profit margins. But first, she needed to find the courage to reveal the full truth about why she'd really come to Millfield and what she was prepared to offer in return for the gift of remembering what business could be when it was done with integrity, compassion, and genuine care for the people it served. Phoebe Collins didn't get into her Mercedes. Instead, she closed the driver's door and walked back toward the garage with the determined stride of someone who'd made a decision that couldn't be unmade. The late afternoon sun caught the auburn highlights in her hair, and when she turned to face Clarence and Riley, her expression held the gravity of someone preparing to cross a bridge they'd been avoiding for days. "I need to tell you the whole truth," she said, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of nervousness that neither Clarence nor Riley had heard before, "about who I am, why I'm really here, and what this week has meant to me." Clarence set down the diagnostic computer he'd been preparing to pack away, sensing that whatever Phoebe was about to reveal would require his full attention. Riley closed her calculus textbook completely and turned to face the woman who'd become such an unexpected part of their lives. "I told you I was the CEO of Hartwell Automotive Group," Phoebe began, "but I didn't tell you what that actually means. We're not just a regional chain with a few dozen dealerships. Hartwell is one of the largest privately held automotive companies in the country. We own 237 dealerships across 12 states, 4 parts manufacturing facilities, 3 restoration centers, and a financial services division that handles automotive loans for nearly 250,000 customers." Riley's eyes widened at the scope of what Phoebe was describing, but Clarence found himself nodding with the understanding of someone who'd suspected the truth was larger than the version he'd been told. "Last year, our revenue was just over $3 billion, Phoebe continued, her tone becoming more businesslike as she recited familiar statistics. "We employ nearly 15,000 people directly, and our business relationships support probably another 50,000 jobs throughout our supply chain." She paused, letting the magnitude of these numbers settle before continuing. "6 months ago, I was the cover story in Forbes magazine, the woman who revolutionized automotive retail. They wrote about my innovative approach to market consolidation, my efficiency improvements, my success at increasing profit margins through strategic acquisitions and operational optimization." Clarence could see where this story was heading, but he let her tell it at her own pace. What the article didn't mention was that I hadn't actually driven a car for pleasure in over 2 years, that I couldn't remember the last time I'd had a conversation about automobiles that didn't involve market share or competitive analysis, that I'd become so focused on managing Hartwell as a financial entity that I'd completely lost touch with why people actually care about cars. Phoebe walked over to the thank you cards pinned to Clarence's bulletin board, studying them as if they contained some secret she was trying to decode. "The stress-related incident I mentioned, it happened during a presentation about our plan to acquire and restructure 43 independent repair shops throughout the Midwest. I was explaining to our board how we could increase efficiency by standardizing their operations, eliminating redundant services, and reducing labor costs through automation." Her voice grew quieter, more personal. "I collapsed right in the middle of describing how we could improve profit margins by 15% while reducing our workforce by nearly 30%. The paramedics said I'd been having heart palpitations for hours without realizing it." Riley reached out instinctively, as if wanting to comfort someone recounting a traumatic experience. "My doctor said I needed to step away from work completely. No board meetings, no conference calls, no strategic planning sessions. He suggested I do something that would reconnect me with whatever had made me passionate about the automotive industry in the first place." Phoebe turned away from the bulletin board to face them directly. "But here's the part I haven't told you yet. I didn't just randomly drive through Millfield and happen to break down. I've been researching small independent automotive businesses for months, trying to understand what we were destroying when we acquired and optimized them." Clarence felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You've been researching places like this?" Hall's Roadside Repair was on a list of potential acquisition targets that our expansion team compiled last year, Phoebe admitted, her words coming faster now, as if confession was providing its own momentum, not for immediate purchase, but as part of a 5-year plan to establish Hartwell presence in underserved rural markets. The garage fell completely silent except for the soft hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic on Route 47. Riley looked between her father and Phoebe with growing understanding, while Clarence absorbed the implications of what he'd just heard. "So this was never about car trouble," he said slowly. "This was about what? Market research. It started that way," Phoebe said quickly. "I wanted to understand what made independent shops successful, what value they provided that our corporate model couldn't replicate. I thought if I could spend time in one of these places, observe the operations, understand the customer relationships. I could figure out how to preserve whatever was important while still achieving the efficiencies that Hartwell needed. She gestured around the garage, her expression becoming more animated as she tried to explain. But then I got here, and I watched you spend 20 minutes explaining brake pad options to Mrs. Patterson because you wanted her to make the best decision for her budget, not the most profitable decision for your business. I saw Riley doing homework at the front desk because this garage is also your home, your family's life, not just a commercial operation. I witnessed you turn down profitable work because you didn't have the equipment to do it safely, even though customers were willing to take the risk. Phoebe's voice grew stronger, more certain. I realized that everything I thought I knew about business efficiency was wrong. You're not inefficient, Clarence. You're doing something that my company has forgotten how to do. You're treating every customer interaction as if it matters more than the transaction itself. You're building relationships instead of just processing services. Clarence was quiet for a long moment, processing not just what Phoebe had revealed, but what it meant about their entire relationship over the past week. So when you were asking about my dreams for expanding this place, when you were talking about equipment leasing and cooperative purchasing arrangements, I was trying to understand how someone with your values and your customer focus could be given the resources to do what you do on a larger scale. Phoebe finished. I was trying to figure out what business could look like if profit wasn't the only measure of success. Riley, who had been listening with the intense concentration she usually reserved for particularly challenging math problems, spoke up. But you said your company was planning to acquire places like this. Doesn't that mean you were planning to get rid of what makes them special? Phoebe's expression grew pained. That was the plan, yes. Acquire independent operations, integrate them into our corporate structure, eliminate redundancies, standardize procedures. It's what we've done successfully 136 times before. And now, Clarence asked, now I think we've been defining success wrong, Phoebe said with conviction. This week has shown me what we lose when we optimize everything for efficiency. It's shown me what automotive service can be when it's driven by genuine care for customers, rather than quarterly earnings targets. She looked directly at Clarence, her eyes holding an intensity that made clear how much this conversation mattered to her. You asked me what I was really doing here. The truth is, I came to Millfield to study a business model I thought was obsolete. Instead, I discovered a business philosophy that I want to learn from, that I need to learn from if I'm going to figure out how to run Hartwell in a way that actually serves the communities we operate in. Clarence stared at her for a long moment, trying to reconcile the woman who'd spent a week handing him tools and sharing coffee with the CEO of a $3 billion corporation, who'd originally seen his garage as a potential acquisition target. So what happens now? He asked finally. Phoebe's expression shifted, becoming both hopeful and uncertain. Now I ask if you'd be willing to help me figure out what comes next, she said, because I have some ideas about how we might be able to solve your problems, and mine at the same time, ideas that could change everything for both of us. The late afternoon sun slanted through the garage doors, casting long shadows across the floor as three people stood at the threshold of a conversation that would determine not just their individual futures, but the fate of a business model that prioritized human relationships over profit margins. Clarence looked at Riley, who nodded with the quiet confidence of someone who'd already made up her mind about trusting the woman who'd brought such unexpected possibilities into their lives. All right, he said finally, let's hear what you have in mind. Phoebe walked to her Mercedes and retrieved a leather portfolio from the passenger seat, her movements deliberate and purposeful. When she returned, her entire demeanor had shifted, from apologetic confessor to confident business executive presenting a proposal that could change everything. What I'm about to suggest is going to sound impossible, she began, spreading documents across Clarence's workbench. But I need you to hear me out completely before you decide I've lost my mind. The first document was a detailed business plan titled Hall Hartwell Community Automotive Center, a new model for rural service excellence. Clarence stared at his own name in the header, feeling slightly dizzy. I want to create a partnership Between Hartwell Automotive and Hall's Roadside Repair, Phoebe explained, her voice gaining strength as she outlined her vision. Not an acquisition, not a buyout, a true partnership where you maintain complete operational control while gaining access to Hartwell's resources. Riley leaned in closer, studying the financial projections that covered the second page. Dad, these numbers. The partnership would provide immediate funding for new equipment, including a state-of-the-art hydraulic lift and diagnostic systems, Phoebe continued. But more importantly, it would establish Hall's as the flagship location for a new kind of automotive service center, one that combines corporate resources with independent values. Clarence found his voice. What would that actually look like? You'd expand to serve as both a traditional repair shop and a training center for automotive technicians. Young people from across the region could come here to learn trades that provide real career opportunities. The Hartwell Foundation would fund full scholarships for students like Riley, while also supporting your operational costs. Phoebe pointed to a section of the proposal that outlines staffing plans. You'd hire additional mechanics, creating jobs in Millfield while handling increased capacity. But every employee would be trained in your approach to customer service, genuine care, honest advice, fair pricing. And what does Hartwell get out of this? Clarence asked, still struggling to believe what he was hearing. We get to learn from you, Phoebe said simply. Every insight about customer relationships, every innovation in service delivery, every lesson about building community trust. We take that knowledge and apply it to transform our entire corporate culture. Riley looked up from the financial documents. Dad, this would pay for my college and create jobs for dozens of people. Clarence stared at the proposal, seeing his modest garage transformed into something that could serve the entire region, while maintaining the values that made it special. I need time to think about this, he said finally. Phoebe nodded. Of course. But Clarence, there's one more thing. She met his eyes directly. This isn't charity. This is the future of automotive service, and you're the person who can show us how to build it right. Outside, the sun was setting over Millfield, painting the sky in shades of possibility that Clarence had almost forgotten how to see. 18 months later, the transformation of Hall's Roadside Repair into the Hall Hartwell Community Automotive Center had exceeded even Phoebe's most optimistic projections. The original garage had been expanded into a state-of-the-art facility that somehow managed to feel both modern and welcoming, where the latest diagnostic equipment shared space, with hand-painted signs that still promised fair prices, honest work, good people. Clarence stood in the main bay on a crisp Saturday morning, watching his team of 6 mechanics work on everything from Mrs. Patterson's faithful Buick to a classic Mustang restoration project that would have been impossible without the specialized equipment the partnership had provided. The new hydraulic lifts hummed efficiently, but more importantly, the conversations between his staff and customers carried the same tone of genuine care that had always defined his approach to automotive service. Dad, the community college group is here for their tour. Riley called from the office that now doubled as her part-time workspace. She was halfway through her junior year at State University, her engineering degree funded entirely by the Hartwell Foundation Scholarship Program, but she spent weekends and breaks working at the center, teaching basic automotive maintenance to anyone who wanted to learn. The tour group consisted of 15 high school students from surrounding counties, all participants in the automotive technology program that had become the center's most visible success story. Over the past year, 12 graduates had found permanent employment with local businesses, 4 had been accepted to 4-year engineering programs, and 2 had started their own small repair shops, using techniques they'd learned under Clarence's mentoring. Welcome to Hall Hartwell, Clarence addressed the group, standing beside the memorial wall that honored Sarah's memory, alongside a display of thank you letters from customers whose lives had been touched by the center's work. Before we begin, I want you to understand what we're really about here. Yes, we fix cars, but more than that, we fix the connection between people and the machines that help them live their lives. As the students dispersed throughout the facility, guided by staff members who treated each question as an opportunity to share knowledge rather than an interruption, Clarence caught sight of Phoebe entering through the main bay doors. She'd driven down from Chicago for the monthly partnership review. But these visits had evolved far beyond business meetings into genuine celebrations of what they'd built together. The board meeting went well, she announced, settling into the office chair that had become permanently designated as hers. Corporate profits are up 8% this year, but more importantly, customer satisfaction scores across all Hardwell locations have reached record highs because you've been implementing the community-focused approach at other locations, Riley observed, looking up from the enrollment paperwork she'd been organizing for next month's training. Cohort Phoebe nodded with satisfaction. 43 locations now operate using principles we developed here. Longer conversations with customers, honest recommendations over profitable upselling, investment in employee training that emphasizes relationship building over transaction processing. And it's actually more profitable than the old way, Clarence added with some amazement. Turns out that customers who trust you come back more often and recommend you to their friends. Revolutionary concept, Phoebe said with a grin that had become much more frequent over the past 18 months. As the afternoon wore on, the garage filled with its usual Saturday mix of customers, students, and community members who'd simply stopped by to share coffee and conversation. Mrs. Patterson arrived with her grandson, who was considering the automotive program. Tommy Morrison brought his new girlfriend to show off the motorcycle that had sparked his own interest in mechanical work. Mrs. Henderson delivered fresh cookies and updates on the food pantry that now received regular support from the center's Community Outreach Fund. You know what I realized? Phoebe said as they watched Riley explain engine timing to a group of fascinated teenagers. I spent 20 years trying to build something impressive, but you'd already built something important. Clarence smiled, thinking of all the mornings he'd wondered if his modest garage would ever amount to more than a way to pay the bills and keep Riley fed. I was just trying to take care of people. That's exactly what made it important, Phoebe replied, and that's exactly what made it worth scaling up. As the sun set over Millfield, casting golden light through the expanded bay doors of the center that had become a beacon for automotive education throughout the region, Clarence Hall reflected on the unexpected ways that help could arrive. A broken-down Mercedes had brought more than just a well-paying repair job. It had brought a reminder that dreams deferred weren't necessarily dreams denied, that sometimes the right partnership could transform struggle into purpose. The hand-painted sign still hung above the main entrance, though it had been carefully restored and reinforced. Where every note matters had been replaced with where every person matters, but the spirit remained unchanged. Because in the end, the most important thing they'd learned was that sustainable business success came not from optimizing profit margins, but from optimizing the ways they served their community. And in garages and training centers across the Midwest, young people were learning that mechanical skills and human compassion weren't separate subjects, but to parts of the same essential curriculum for building a life that mattered. The transformation was complete, but the legacy was just beginning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.